By the late 1990s, the travel agency on the main street of most American towns had already begun to close. The window displays with their poster-sized photos of beaches and European capitals came down. The rotating brochure racks went into dumpsters. The agents who had spent 20 years building relationships with airlines, cruise lines, and hotel chains found that the knowledge they had accumulated over a career was now available to anyone with a phone line and a browser. The internet didn't kill the travel agent overnight, but it removed the condition that had made the travel agent necessary in the first place, the information gap. Once that gap closed, the economics followed. But if you booked a vacation through a travel agent before any of that happened, if you sat across the desk from someone who knew the hotels in Florence better than most Florentines, you know that what disappeared wasn't just a transaction. It was a particular kind of expertise applied in service of ordinary people, and nothing built to replace it has fully replicated what it provided. The travel agency, as most Americans encountered it through the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s, was a small storefront operation, often independently owned, sometimes affiliated with a larger consortium, but run day to day by the same 2 or 3 people who had been there for years. You walked in without an appointment usually, sat down across from an agent and described what you wanted. A week somewhere warm in February, a trip to see family across the country, a honeymoon, an anniversary, a graduation present for a daughter going to Europe for the first time. The agent listened, asked questions, and then did something you couldn't do yourself. They picked up the phone and called. They had direct lines to airline reservation desks, direct contacts at hotel chains, relationships with tour operators who could put together an itinerary and a destination the agent had often visited personally. The brochures on the rack by the door were reference material, but the agent's real inventory was in their head and in the Rolodex on their desk. They knew which cruise ship had the best dining, and which had the noise problem on the lower decks. They knew which resort looked better in the photographs than it performed in reality. They knew when to book early and when to wait, which airlines had the best record on a particular route, which connecting airport was the one you wanted to avoid in winter. That knowledge had been built over years of actual experience, from trade trips the airlines and resorts organized to let agents see the product firsthand, from the feedback of clients who came back and reported honestly on how the trip had gone, from conversations with other agents in the same professional network. It was not theoretical knowledge. It was the kind that comes from repeated exposure, corrected over time by results. The commission structure that supported this system was invisible to the customer because it was paid by the supplier, not the traveler. Airlines paid travel agents a standard commission on every ticket sold, typically around 10% through most of the post-war era. Hotels paid commissions on room bookings. Cruise lines paid on cabin sales. Tour operators built agent commissions into the price of their packages. The traveler paid the same price whether they booked through an agent or directly, and in many cases the agent could negotiate rates or add amenities that the traveler couldn't access independently. From the customer's perspective, the service was effectively free. You sat across from someone with genuine expertise, described what you wanted, and they handled the research, the booking, the ticketing, the confirmation, the follow-up, and the problem-solving if anything went wrong, at no additional cost to you. That arrangement held for decades, and it worked well enough that most Americans who traveled regularly came to rely on it as the default way that travel was organized. The first significant crack appeared in 1995 when the major domestic airlines began cutting the base commission rate they paid to agents. The standard 10% commission that had anchored the agency business model for decades was reduced to 8%, then capped at a flat dollar amount per ticket regardless of the fare. The airlines were under pressure from their own cost structures, and they had begun to see the early travel websites as a more efficient distribution channel than the agent network. Cutting agent commissions shifted more bookings toward direct channels and reduced the cost per ticket sold. For the airlines, the math was clear. For travel agents, it was the beginning of a structural erosion that would not reverse. By 2002, most of the major carriers had eliminated base commissions to travel agents entirely. An agency that had built its revenue on airline ticket commissions was now selling those tickets at cost, absorbing the labor and overhead of the transaction without compensation from the supplier. The agencies that survived that cut were the ones that had already shifted their business toward cruises, package tours, and specialty travel, segments where commissions still existed, and where the agent's expertise was harder for a website to replicate. The agencies that hadn't made that shift closed. At the same time, the internet was doing something more fundamental than cutting commissions. It was publishing the information. Airline schedules, seat availability, and fares had previously existed inside reservation systems that only agents could access through dedicated terminals. By the late 1990s, that information was on consumer websites. searchable by anyone, sortable by price, with booking completed in minutes without speaking to anyone. The hotel inventory that had required a phone call and a relationship was now on listing platforms where photographs, pricing, and availability were visible simultaneously across hundreds of properties. What the agent had known and translated for the client was now directly accessible to the client. The translation was no longer required. That shift happened quickly enough that many agencies didn't have time to adapt. A storefront that had been fully functional in 1994 was operating in a fundamentally different environment by 2000. And the customers who had been loyal for years were booking online not out of dissatisfaction but out of convenience. The agency had been the most convenient option available. When something more convenient appeared, the loyalty followed the convenience. The number of travel agencies in the United States fell from roughly 34,000 in the mid-1990s to under 13,000 by the mid-2000s. Employment in the industry dropped by more than half in the same period. These were not marginal businesses. They were fixtures in commercial strips and shopping centers across the country, employing people who had chosen the work as a career and built genuine expertise over the course of that career. The agents who remained in the industry after the consolidation were largely those who had carved out a specialization deep enough that the general-purpose booking sites couldn't substitute for it. The agent who knew river cruises in Portugal with the kind of detail that only comes from having taken 4 of them. The agent who specialized in African safari logistics and understood which camps required which vaccinations, which seasons offered which conditions, which operators had safety records worth examining. That level of depth survived because no algorithm had yet learned to replicate it. But the generalist travel agent, the person who booked family vacations to Disney and flights to see grandchildren and package tours to Cancun, that role was gone, absorbed by websites that did the same job faster and without a commission to pass along in any direction. What the booking site never replaced was the judgment that came with experience. A website can show you every available hotel in a city sorted by price. It cannot tell you that the hotel in the 3rd position has thin walls and a kitchen exhaust that runs until 2 in the morning, because a couple from your town stayed there in October and mentioned it when they came back. A website can show you flight options with connections. It cannot tell you that the connection you're considering has failed reliably in bad weather for 3 winters running and that there is a better option 1 row down. The agent knew these things because her business ran on repeat clients, and repeat clients came back only if the trip went well. Her incentive was your satisfaction, not the completion of a transaction. When the transaction moved online, that incentive structure changed. The platform's interest was in volume. The individual trip and whether it matched what you had described when you sat down to plan it was no longer anyone's professional concern. You had the information. The booking was complete. What happened after that was between you and the supplier. The person who had stood between you and a bad decision and whose livelihood depended on preventing it was no longer in the room. If you remember sitting across from someone who talked you out of one hotel and into a better one, who called the airline and got you on an earlier flight when your plans changed, who had been to the place you were going and could tell you what it was actually like, leave a comment. Tell us where the agency was, what you remember about the person behind the desk, and where they sent you. That record matters. Subscribe if you want to keep looking at the parts of American life that changed faster than most people noticed, and like the video if it brought something back. The travel agent didn't disappear because she did her job poorly. She disappeared because the job she did was reclassified as something a machine could handle. Whether that reclassification was correct is a different question, and the answer depends entirely on the last trip you took and whether it went the way you planned.